Chapter 23, Part 2. Daniel had never seen anything like it. Though Eric was obviously still somewhat dazed, seeing his friends in danger had unleashed a new rage in him. Black tendrils lashed at his face and hands, but he shrugged them off, oblivious to the bloody red welts they left on his body. Through an act of sheer will, he fought his way past Plunkett's defenses, and when the two superpowered beings collided, the entire quarry shook with violence. Daniel heard someone call his name, and when he turned to see Molly and the rest of the group scrambling over the rocks to reach him. They were all there. Even Rose had appeared in their midst. Clay was conscious, and Daniel found some amusement in the fact that it was Rowan who was helping him limp along. "Daniel, are you all right?" asked Molly, her voice barely audible over the sounds of Eric's furious fighting. Daniel nodded, his eyes locking on the struggle raging nearby. "We have to help Eric," she shouted. "He won't be able to keep this up for long." Rowan was saying something, but his words were lost in the cacophony around him. "What?" Daniel yelled. "I said," shouted Rowan, moving closer, "that we need to get out of here. This quarry isn't as stable as it looks, and the fighting is going to bring the walls down on top of our heads. I can hear the rumbling already." "We can't leave Eric," said Molly. "We won't," said Daniel. "I promise." The tide was turning. Strong as Eric was, he was clearly no match for the Shroud's powers, and he was weakening fast. "Clay," said Daniel, "can you still fight?" Clay shrugged and spat. "Yeah, I heal pretty fast. I was just a little lightheaded is all. That creep jumped me while my back was turned." But for all Clay's bluster, he still seemed wobbly on his feet. Daniel hoped that the bully-turned-ally would be strong enough to last at least a few rounds against the Shroud. "What's the plan?" asked Rowan. "The plan is that you and Bud take Louisa and Rose to safety. Your powers aren't going to help against the Shroud." "And what about you?" asked Rowan. "You don't have any powers at all." "No, but I figured out Plunkett's weakness. Besides, I owe it to Eric. Now get out of here. We'll join you when we can." Rowan looked as if he was ready to argue, but in the end he just nodded. When he turned to gather up the troops, he noticed that Bud was already halfway up the trail. "Didn't have to ask him twice," Rowan muttered. Louisa surprised Daniel with a quick kiss on the cheek. "Be careful." Daniel hoped that the grime on his face sufficiently covered his blushing. One look at Molly told him that it didn't. Rowan led the others after Bud, and Daniel wasted no time watching them go. "Here's what we do. Clay, you need to get in there and help Eric. Then, while Plunkett's distracted, Molly, I need you to get me as close to him as you can." "Why?" Clay asked. "What can you do?" Daniel allowed himself a small grin. "It's always in the details. Plunkett slipped up and told me the source of his power. Now I just have to take it from him." "Tell me," said Molly. "I'm faster." "No," said Daniel. "You can't touch it, either of you. If you do, you'll end up like Simon. It's gotta be me." "Well, new kid, you're no coward, I'll give you that," Clay said, cracking his knuckles as he talked. "As for me, time for round 2. Then Clay Cudgens ran down the side of the ravine to join the fight. No longer on the defensive, the Shroud had Eric cornered against the rock wall of the quarry. Large chunks of limestone fell around them as they traded blows. Daniel worried that soon Eric would be unable to defend himself. Then nothing would prevent Plunkett from stealing Eric's powers and adding them to his own. Molly let out a low whistle as Clay blindsided the Shroud and brought him tumbling to the ground. "I never thought I'd say it, but I'm glad Clay Cudgens has our back." It was an all-out scrape now, as the three of them tumbled and rolled across the quarry floor, in the kicked-up dust and gravel. It was hard to tell the combatants apart. Meanwhile, an ominous rumbling had become audible to even Daniel's ears. Pretty soon, the whole quarry was going to come crashing down around them. "Okay, Molly," said Daniel, putting his arms around her neck. "The next opening you see, go for it. Fly me straight into him." "Are you sure about this?" "Not at all, but it's the best chance we've got." Molly wrapped her arms around his waist and smiled, but her eyes were glued to the scene below. Daniel didn't have time to respond, because in that moment, the Shroud let out a fierce shout of victory as he threw his enemies to the ground. He brought himself to his full height, the black tentacles of shadow forming into long, jagged spikes above the heads of Eric and Clay. Molly reacted quicker than lightning. She flew so fast that Daniel hardly had time to register any movement at all. One minute, he was standing on the hill holding on to her. In the next, he was hitting what felt like a wall of bricks. Layer upon layer of the thick shadow stuff flooded his vision as he struggled to keep from suffocating in the dark. But Daniel knew that there was a solid body underneath that darkness, Plunkett's body. As the shroud, Plunkett had the strength to snap Daniel in two, but it took concentration for those powers to work, and Plunkett was currently busy with Molly, who was delivering a flurry of blows at lightning speed. Though Molly's blows did little real harm, Plunkett was momentarily knocked off balance from the sheer ferocity of her attack. Hopefully, a moment would be all that Daniel needed, because a moment was all that he would get. Daniel groped in the dark, searching for the shroud's burning heart. His hands found the fabric of Plunkett's sweater. The answer was in the details, and the most important detail about Plunkett's powers was that they came from an outside source, the meteorite stone. Plunkett had fashioned one stone into a ring, but Daniel hadn't noticed any rings on Plunkett's fingers. That meant that he wore a stone in some other way, around his neck perhaps, near his chest. There was a sudden hiss as Plunkett realized what Daniel was searching for. They were soon locked in a fierce wrestling match. Daniel's hand closing on Plunkett's throat as Plunkett tried to get a grip on the boy to throw him off. Pain shot up Daniel's bad arm, but he ignored it. He willed himself to keep moving, his fingers to keep searching, clawing at the collar of Plunkett's shirt. And there, he found it, strung on a chain around the old man's neck. Daniel's fist closed around the smooth stone pendant in the center of that ball of fire. It burned his hand, but he refused to let go. He tugged harder, but the chain held. Daniel's breath was being forced out of him as the vicious blackness pressed into his mouth and down his nose. He's drowning me, Daniel realized. He's drowning me in shadow. Daniel's lungs burned and his stomach retched as the oily stuff seeped down his throat. His head started swimming and his eyes began to glaze over with a different kind of darkness. He was losing consciousness, and soon he would lose his life. Just as he was gathering his remaining energy for one last pull, he felt arms around his waist, tugging at him, lending him their weight, their own strength. There was a deafening rumble, but he couldn't tell if it was the sound of the walls falling, or the blood pounding in his own ears. Like a human chain, the fighting children of Noble's Green pulled together, and Daniel felt a snap as the stone yanked loose in his hand. As the world collapsed around him with a roar, the ground seemed to open up beneath him, and together with his enemy, he tumbled into blackness. Sorry if I messed up a few more times than normal, or, my voice sounds weird. I normally do these audiobooks out in the van, but I'm in the house right now and I'm in a kind of awkward position, so I apologize.